Glass. Written and narrated by David Pickering. They knew that Princess Alexandra, aunt to Ludwig II of Bavaria, was mad when she told everyone she had swallowed a grand piano made of glass. Not that she was the only one in the family to suffer in such a manner. Ludwig's brother Otto caused consternation by running around barking like a dog, while Ludwig himself once invited his favourite horse, a grey mare called Cosa Rara, to dine with him. On another occasion he sent a sofa out to a palace guard because he looked tired. Lark Buchanan, who was not a royal but the infant daughter of a well-regarded Long Island business magnate, had a thing about glass too. But that did not mean she was mad in everything. A sweet-natured child, she was perfectly capable of organizing her own young existence, of holding a conversation, of doing all the ordinary daily things of privileged Long Island life in the golden years before the Depression ruined everything, just as long as no glass was involved. "I don't like that doll. I don't like its eyes." That was when the curiosity first revealed itself. She was barely 4 years old. The doll with glass eyes, which had been a gift from Mrs. Buchanan before she died of tuberculosis 2 years earlier, was taken away by the child's young nurse. She removed the glass eyes and replaced them lovingly with eyes of sewn thread. It was a job she would not trust to one of the many maids in the Buchanan mansion, and instead took care of herself. Her hands were small and her fingers slender. Her stitching was flawless. To the nurse's secret disappointment, however, the girl never warmed to this new doll, whose eyes were less frightening now, but dead. Glass terrified her. There was no reasoning with the girl about it, although in all other things she was amenable. She screamed so loudly and for so long when in the presence of glass in any form that it unsettled everyone. It proved impossible to find out from the girl herself what it was about glass that so upset her. Professional advice was sought, but proved unhelpful. Yes, the doctors agreed, there was a problem here, a phobia to which they were even able to give a technical name, hylophobia or hyalophobia. In all other respects, though, they professed to find Lark Buchanan admirably sane, a rational and well-balanced little individual. It was not that she was deranged like Ludwig II's aunt so famously was. It was just that she did not like glass. The doctors balked at sharing with Lark's father the full case history of Ludwig II's mad aunt, the only other glass-related psychosis they knew of. In the princess's case, the glass phobia had been a manifestation of a deeper-seated madness, but there was no other indication of such difficulties here. Besides, the fates of the Bavarian royal family, they agreed, were altogether too bleak and alarming to be applied to a little girl. Lark's father was strangely comforted by the fact that the doctors could give a name to Lark's terror of glass. Unfortunately, the only practical treatment the doctors could suggest involved Lark being exposed frequently and at length to the very thing that she detested, a cruelty that her father could not and would not contemplate. In the end, it was easier to give in. Lark's father, a bear of a man still grieving over the loss of his vivacious young German-born wife, a brilliant violinist, latched onto his daughter's fear and determined to do everything he could to assuage it. Wooden shutters were substituted for the windows in the girl's bedroom, and the glass mirrors were replaced with polished sheets of metal. Her perfumes were poured into little china pots with cork stoppers. Her glass necklaces and brooches were removed from her jewellery box and replaced with ones made of more acceptable material. When she came downstairs, Lark was seated with her back to the picture windows that opened onto the lawn, and her drinks were served in china cups or silver beakers. The cook was instructed to get rid of any culinary utensils made of glass, while bottles brought up from the cellars had to be decanted by the servants into jugs outside the kitchen door. Nothing made of glass was permitted anywhere inside the house. Glass toys and ornaments were thrown out or given away. Glass was stripped from the frames of photographs and watercolours, with the inevitable result that the images faded. Nothing much could be done with the glass light bulbs. Instead, they were concealed behind cotton shades, and the girl managed to ignore them most of the time, even though she knew perfectly well they were still there. The ban on glass was also observed in the grounds surrounding the Buchanan mansion. A big conservatory opening onto a terrace at the back of the house, with a fine view of Long Island Sound, was demolished. Several greenhouses were also dismantled, and flowers were bought in for planting around the gardens or arranging about the house in big vases. It was something she would grow out of, Lark's doting father insisted. He liked to look upon it as something endearing, a childish whim that only made him love the girl, his sole offspring, more. It was not a big thing, after all. A quick explanation to house guests or new tutors or staff was usually sufficient to prevent the inadvertent introduction of glass into the house. Watches with their glass faces were a particular nuisance, though, and the staff were warned to keep a special eye out for them. Guests discovered to be wearing watches were invited to leave them on a tray in the inner porch, from which they could be retrieved when they left. Lark was such a delightful child to be around that no one objected to this arrangement. Outsiders accepted it with a smile as just another harmless example of the eccentricity of the rich, something to be respected, reverenced even. Mr. Buchanan rarely ventured out with his daughter, even when she grew older, as the outside world was harder to control. When they did go out, they tried to make the journey by old-fashioned pony and trap, rather than by glassed-in motor car. The sight of the many windows in the houses they passed sometimes distressed Lark, so they tended not to stop, but to ghost through the surrounding neighbourhood at a brisk pace. How it had all begun remained a mystery. There had been no traumatic incident involving glass during Lark's early infancy, no scary story that anyone could remember telling her concerning glass, nothing that could be pinpointed as a cause of her terror. People grew tired of conjecturing about the origins of her condition, and instead learned to live with it and to adapt to it, to the extent that they almost forgot they were doing it. It was not too much to ask, particularly as Lark grew up into a beautiful girl, with clear blue eyes and porcelain skin. She had a bright, inquiring mind and an endearing sense of humour, as well as a natural talent for music. In the evening she sang for her father in a light soprano voice that filled his heart with the tenderest emotion. Fortunately, she had proved to have excellent eyesight and did not need spectacles to read music. If it had not been for her problem with glass, Lark could, Mr. Buchanan was convinced, have followed his deceased wife into a great musical career. It was not difficult to find others who agreed with him. In short, everybody loved the girl, and a good marriage was expected. A young man from a neighbouring Long Island family, who had already established a reputation as a broker in Manhattan, became a regular caller, and charmed the teen-aged Lark with his easy manner and casual good looks. He also had an attractive tenor singing voice that matched Lark's enchanting soprano to perfection. Mr. Buchanan liked the boy immensely, and after only half a dozen of his visits had started, almost without realizing it, to call him son. The young man, to his credit, took Lark's aversion to glass with great seriousness when informed of it, and did not ridicule it or attempt to cajole the beautiful young woman into submission. Instead, he removed the glass windshield from his new Ford, as well as the mirrors, the headlights, and all the glass covering the dials of the instrument panel, so that he could drive her down to the coast for a day at the beach, bathing and basking in the sun. The day went so well, and Lark was so pretty in her swimwear, that on an impulse the boy asked her to marry him. She replied, with becoming shyness, that it was very sudden, and that he would really have to ask Mr. Buchanan for permission, but he could tell from the way she smiled at him that she would say yes. It was on the way back to the Buchanan mansion that the accident happened. A large Buick Tourer coming down to the beach from the opposite direction, loaded with students starting their summer vacation, veered onto the wrong side of the road and ploughed into their smaller Ford. The boy was pinned to his seat by the steering wheel, but Lark was thrown forwards by the impact, and, because there was no windshield to stop her, she smashed into the front window of the Buick. The glass shattered into thousands of pieces. It took months of care before Lark, leaning heavily upon her father's arm, was allowed by the specialists out of hospital. For years afterwards, pieces of glass continued to work their way agonizingly up through the flesh of her face and to erupt bloodily from her skin. Several times the doctors insisted that she undergo painful operations to remove deeper splinters. Her good looks, it was agreed, were destroyed. The boy, himself severely injured, stopped calling after just a few weeks. Even Lark's father, who had always fancied he saw echoes of her mother's face in the set of Lark's features, struggled to find her there now. Lark reacted calmly enough when news arrived that the boy had become engaged to another girl. "Are you all right, dear?" her father asked her after she had been silent for a long time. Lark nodded and wiped her eyes. "I wish Mother was here," was all she said. Because they never talked about the long-dead Mrs. Buchanan, had not talked about her for years, because it was too upsetting for both of them, Lark's father did not know what to say, so nothing further was said. Lark's fear of glass did not end with the accident. If anything, it increased in intensity, to the point where she could not even abide to hear glass mentioned, or to look at newspaper photographs of men in spectacles. She left the confines of the Buchanan mansion only with the greatest reluctance, usually to submit herself to medical procedures that could not be conducted at home. Lark's father responded by looking out a history of the royal family of Bavaria to discover what had eventually happened to Ludwig II's aunt Alexandra, she who had claimed to have swallowed a grand piano made of glass. It transpired that the princess had died insane at the age of 49 after many years of fruitless search for a surgeon who could help her. Ludwig had ended no better, with his drowned body being found alongside that of his psychiatrist in shallow water 20 yards from the shore of Starnberger Lake in June 1866. He had been on his way to a mental asylum in Munich. Quite what had happened was never clearly established. He was succeeded by his brother Otto, the barking one, who spent his last years living in a palace adapted to serve as a royal lunatic asylum. Mr. Buchanan, shocked, burned the book to ashes in his grate, lest Lark should see it. The last time he saw his daughter before he died of heart disease, he sighed as he watched her nursing yet another weeping wound in her cheek. "What pains us keeps us alive," was all he said. He had lost everything in the crash of 1929, and it was only through the kindness of friends that he and his daughter were able to stay in the big Long Island house, which felt very empty after they had to let all the staff go. Lark did not marry, though her good looks returned to a degree as her scars grew less raw. She passed the rest of her days as a recluse in the big house she had always lived in, having a few groceries delivered once a week and listening to Caruso and Charlie Apin on a scratchy gramophone player. Once a year she went down the hill to tend the graves of her parents in the cemetery nearby. When, still not quite an old woman, she finally died of the same condition as her father, it was found that, although everything else of her childhood had been disposed of long ago, she had kept the doll with eyes of sewn thread through all the years. The gift of a mother she had barely known, it was placed in her coffin and buried with her in the family plot. Her mother didn't really die of tuberculosis. Lark's 93-year-old former nurse, she of the small hands and slender fingers and so good at stitching, confided to her 2 grandsons as they wheeled her away from the cemetery. That was just put about to protect the girl from the truth. The fact is, Mrs. Buchanan killed herself because her daughter wasn't her daughter at all. She couldn't have children herself, and she just couldn't stand it any longer. She was the sensitive sort, you see, being a musician and all. Her husband had had an affair, and Lark was the other woman's child. But it was agreed that Lark would live with her father as the child of him and his wife. The girl would have a much better life that way, and there would be no scandal. Things like that mattered in those days. The old nurse's fingers fumbled in her bag for a handkerchief. Lark missed the woman she thought was her mother terribly, you know. I believe she felt it was her fault somehow that her mother wasn't there. She blew her nose noisily and sighed. I often wonder if it might have been better if she had known the truth. The old woman glanced over her shoulder at the distant grave, where no one stood any more. After his wife's death, Mr. Buchanan found the real mother a job in the household, but it was never the same as it had been before. He blamed her, you see, for his wife's death, and he blamed himself, of course. He paid her off in the end, generously, on condition that she never approached or spoke to Lark again. The real mother didn't want to give her up a second time, but she could see no other option. In the end she agreed, and she had a good life, a very good life. 2 gravediggers approached the open grave and began to fold up the artificial grass lining the edges of the pit. The old woman motioned to her grandsons to open the car door for her. As they settled her into the cushions on the back seat, the former nurse kept her eyes on the final resting place of Lark Buchanan. At last, the old woman dared to speculate, her little girl was free of her fear of glass.